Welcome to the Rethink and Return podcast. My name is Jason Shepard. Every week, we rethink things and return to God's original intention and His design. We generally do 2 recordings a week. One, we revisit a passage of Scripture that thousands of people are studying together in a Sunday gathering or in a house church, and we're just going to dig more deeply into these things that we didn't get to talk about enough or want to talk about more that we're wrestling with. And then we do another recording where we're just working out leadership things, being a pastor and ministry or leading stuff, and wrestling with tensions of how we live like that in our world today. So we'd love for you to like this, subscribe to it, share it with other people. Enjoy the podcast. We'll see you soon. Welcome to the Rethink and Return podcast. We love doing this. Every week we're getting together and talking about the sermon that we talked about yesterday. What preacher doesn't like to talk more about the sermon? I wish we could talk longer on Sundays, but we can't. So we're doing this podcast to dig a little bit deeper into a passage of Scripture. And really, I'm doing it just so I can hang out with my good buddy, long-term pal, fellow preacher, teacher, pastor, Dave Edwards.
So good to be back.
Always glad to have you back, man. When you're gone, we had like Trace Edwards, who's reading out of his Greek Bible, and you're not.
Right.
So anyway, I don't know who's second
I'm
string.
reading the large print
Dude,
today.
reading the large print English version, or the guy who read the Greek Bible last week. But anyway, glad to have you back, Dave.
Good to be back.
We're diving deep right into Galatians. We're just walking through, as we do as a church at Church Product from the time we started 15 years ago, verse by verse through books of the Bible. And we're into like I love Galatians even more than I thought I was going to love preaching it.
I've been blown away by it.
Yeah.
Like there's some memorable passages I memorized in high school that I've always kind of known. But what you went over this past week, like I think for a lot of people, those verses are what I would call flyover verses.
Yeah.
They just seem their names, their people, their places. You're like, oh,
yeah.
history, let's get to it. But like, I had this experience of like highlighting the words that you were bringing out and looking how they came off the text. And so I know that, you don't just write a sermon. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of preparation. It's not an easy thing. And so I wanted to ask you about just the retention. Like for people that are listening, what's the best way to retain the sermon in terms of taking notes? And if you take notes, how would you recommend people write these things down? Like I have my little flow chart that I do.
Yeah, you do.
And I've done this for as long as I've been here. I've taken notes my whole life.
Right.
But I think some people maybe just need a little suggestion from the pastor on what should they be writing down, or how do they listen to a sermon that's different than listening to a TED Talk?
That's harder for me to answer, and here's why. And here's the advantage I have. I mean, I've lived in this passage all week long. Right? Like I'm wrestling with it. I have these things right now. This is what I'm doing in a passage. I'm doing an explanation of what it is. I think a lot of pastors don't do this, and I do it all the time. I'm gonna honestly address the tension. Like here's the tension that I'm wrestling with here, which is what we really want happening in a house church,
Right.
We want it in a sermon too. Let people unchurched. There was this guy who came this week. Somebody from our team shared with me a text that this guy showed him. He's like, I thought I'd never again say in my life that it was good to be in church. He said, I've never been in my life as an adult. When I could quit going, in college, I quit going, I never returned. But he's like, because I just needed honesty, like raw honesty from the pulpit. And I'm like, where does the honesty come? It comes right here. Like we give an explanation and then people get points. But I'm like, no. There's a tension here.
That's right.
I mean,
so good.
Scripture is heaven speaking to earth, and we have a tension with this. That's why I think we have to hash it out. I think the best way to retain it is to get in a house church and hash it out with people. Because if my tension is being addressed, right? I mean, if my tension is being addressed, at least discussed. I mean, many people hear a sermon and they never talk about it again or think about it again. But I'm like, live it out. I mean, that's why we're doing the podcast. Just another point of wrestling with this, wondering this. So I do explanation, tension, and then I do an apologetic. Like, all right, what is the defense of this? Like, here's the tension. Why do I believe it? That's the apologetic for me. And then I get into the application. All right, how does this work for me every day in my life, right? And then I like to share like a little bit of wisdom. So, I mean, you probably see those points when you're maybe even better than I do, because you're like, that show Numbers where all the numbers go here?
That beautiful
you're doing
mind.
that with a sermon, And so anyway, but yeah, so I think the best way to do it is to live it in again. Anything we hear once that we don't wrestle with again or talk about again or think about again?
Right.
No way we're going to retain that.
Yeah.
You know? Let's jump into Galatians.
Let's do it. Well, I thought, so I had this experience this week. I just want to say, I love doing this with you because each Sunday I'm not listening as a preacher, I'm listening as a learner.
Oh, that's cool.
And I think that how you position yourself to hear a sermon
I
makes
agree.
a difference. I'm not listening as a critic or
That's
as
cool.
a speaker.
Oh, not like a lot of people.
But as a learner. That's right.
I got a lot of people listening as critics.
Everyone thinks they know more than the pastor.
Well, hey, I'll say that, hey, this has nothing to do with Galatians, but I think for a lot of preachers, myself included, I preached for years. I mean, man, it was so hard for God we talked about sanctification and leadership in one of our Friday podcasts that post on Fridays. But one of the things God had to sanctify in me was like, really caring a lot about the invisible critic out there. Sometimes they're visible, but a lot of times invisible.
Right.
I know you preached a long time too.
So true.
We'll do a podcast.
That should be a whole thing.
All the crazy things in a preacher's head that you got to get over,
That's right.
But I've grown, and I'm not preaching to the critic as more, thankfully. Whether they're there or not, I don't know.
Well, I call them the invisible giants. It's the
Yeah.
things that we all feel that no one else sees.
That's right.
So, but I love this passage because of all the nuances that are in it. When you really started at verse 11, and you said, "For I would have you know, brethren, that the gospel," and then I wrote down. I think a lot of times when it comes to us knowing and sharing the gospel, we get in our own way.
Yeah, sure.
People get in their own way. I wonder, like, have you ever had to deal with anything like that personally? Do you ever feel like you get in your own way?
Of course.
Get up too much in your head when you're trying to share the
All
gospel?
my life. I mean, that's why, here we're, especially through Galatians and especially through the first half, we're going over the gospel again and again and again.
Got to.
It's really just the story of what God has done to save us, who God is and what he's done to save us.
Yeah.
And if I have these little guides, right, like good God gospel guides me through, where am I in this conversation with this person? I'm just in the good. I'm going to stay in the good for a while. It's not time to go to the God. Last week, I had a good move into a God conversation with somebody that I didn't know if it ever happened. It was a while. So just like good God gospel helps me know where I am, the gospel icons for me let me know. It helps me with the story, the creation or the fall or the attempts to get back to God. So God got to us, like all that kind of stuff, And so, here's where we get in our heads when we're sharing the gospel. When we're trying to do something outside of just tell the story of it, we think the story itself isn't powerful. But that's what Paul said. The gospel is the power of God for the salvation of everyone who believes. So for me, I got to go, okay, does the person that I'm talking with, are they ready to hear this? Do they want to hear it? Are they ready to hear it? Because if they're not, I'm not going to force that. But then do they believe this stuff? That's the salvation. That's the power.
Right.
It's not whatever else I do with the gospel. It's the gospel, Paul said, Romans 1:16, the gospel is the power of God for the salvation of all who believe.
That's right.
And so, I can't make them believe. I can just share the gospel. And I think when we start to think we're doing anything else.
True. That's right.
Right, then I got to have all these other things to bring in here to do it, my Greek Bible and my apologetics and the gospel.
People put themselves under so much pressure because they think they gotta lead someone to give their life to Christ. I'm like, only the Holy Spirit can do that.
That's right.
But one of the things I loved is, let me just ask, like you said, you had a couple of good God gospel conversations. You just mentioned it. And what can you provide some detail? Like that was the one thing I wanted to ask because I know there's not enough time to do all that in a sermon. But can you give a little detail of like how that happened? You talked with someone, you had some good conversation. All of a sudden there was that shift, and how did you know it? How did you read that moment?
Yeah,
a lot
that's
of people
cool.
I wouldn't want to know.
I think, we need to do a Thursday podcast on good God gospel, right? Like how that goes.
Yes.
Because, we really want to get into the passage here, but we can camp out here all day long.
Yeah.
But for me this week, I'll just give you one. The one that I never thought is like a Buddhist, never showing any interest in God. We can never get there. We had good conversations over an extended period of time. It's in a restaurant, the owner of a restaurant that I go to. And it was always just restaurant stuff, the crowd's low, all this. We just try to care, gone for a long time. And little by little, they would know our family and we would know their family and ask them questions and just be honoring to them and kind.
Mm-hmm.
And because this person trusted me, they're going through something.
Yeah.
And so she shared that with me this week. I get there a little bit early, waiting on Brooke and a couple of the kids to come to dinner. And so she's at my table and she's like, I said, I can tell something's going on. Are you okay? She's like, I'm not okay. And it's just that sensitivity to somebody, just loving somebody.
Right.
So when I'm like, hey, are you okay? And she's like, I'm not. And then she just tells me what's going on. And then I was able to insert some God stuff for the first time. And really, she was like, I don't think about that, talk about that, go there. And I'm like, I'll talk about as little or as much as you want, but I believe that what you're talking about, the way that I handle that is from God.
Yeah.
And so anyway, it was a beautiful moment.
I think I just think people, that's an informative thing that is going on behind the text, because even Paul is writing to the Galatians about something they're going through. Yeah. He's not just making something up. There's something happening in this situation, and he's addressing it. Yeah. Even in this opening thing, I think with Paul, he does this a lot. He always seems to justify his own credentials. Like there was it's a little defensive, but it's also a little after
that's
what
going to be later in the passage.
And so,
all right, what's the next thing?
Okay,
you see
so
here?
The next thing I see is this quote that you dropped Sunday that says, "Preach the gospel and use words sometimes."
Yeah.
And so you made this comment that that's not in the Bible, and I'm not sure people really know that's not in the Bible.
I mean, I think there are a lot of things that people quote that somehow they think are in the Bible, and it's not. Right. Or I think there's two things. Either one, it's in the Bible, or two, it's biblical. Like they'll take biblical principles and put it together and be like, well, this is a biblical principle. Right. And I'm like, that is neither. The quote is, preach the gospel and when necessary, use words. It's a famous quote. I'll see it on memes.
That's right, sure.
On social media, I'll hear people say it. I've seen it written in books. And there is a principle behind it that is true, which is the life that I'm living should reinforce the gospel, should prove the gospel is true, that Jesus has come and changed my life. But to say the words, preach the gospel and when necessary is use words. Sorry, I'll start over. Preach the gospel, when necessary use words. It's not in the Bible, nor is it biblical.
Right.
It's not biblical.
It's not.
Because the gospel actually is the story of salvation. Like when I share this story, I should be living a life in such a way that people go, I can see that that's true in your life. But people have used it as an excuse to exonerate them from any responsibility of being an evangelist. That's why in our church we have a saying, everyone an evangelist. I mean, evangelism, sharing the gospel, is part of our calling as a follower of Jesus Christ for everyone. So we all got to grow in it. And like I talked about this week, we all have mountains in our life, right? I mean, some people's mountain is purity, some of it's anger, some of it's money, debt, or generosity or giving or whatever. But for many people, another mountain is evangelism. It wasn't my life. And I'm still growing in it. Part of my prayer almost every day at 2:47 in the afternoon, because we push that out. Acts 2:47, the Lord added to their number daily those who are being saved. I pray that I'll be a better evangelist. I pray for myself. In addition to the people I'm praying for and praying for my church, I'm praying for that almost every day. And so anyway, we cannot exonerate ourselves by using an excuse, especially quoting something that we think is biblical and it's unbiblical. It's actually anti-biblical. It goes against this sharing of the gospel.
Jesus never did that. Jesus never said, I'm going to feed you all and y'all just figure out what the source of this is.
That's exactly right.
Right? When he talked about himself, he always demonstrated the words and the actions always went together.
Yeah.
And I had a big argument with a guy years ago on the road that they had done this big humanitarian thing and fed a bunch of people. And I said, well, did you share the gospel? He goes, well, no. They have to just figure that, that's our motivation. I was like, and you got to speak up on this, know? Yeah. And I think when you talk about it being a mountain, like you've climbed actual mountains in your life. And so what's the best, like any mountain, when you said it could be anger, it could be purity, it could be sharing the gospel. What's the best way for someone to challenge themselves to climb that mountain? Like if you could take what you said Sunday a little bit further and say, okay, here's my mountain. What's the best way to take that on? What's a practice that you'd recommend?
Okay. Well, I mean, the first thing, I think everything starts with confession, right? Like, hey, I'm gonna agree with God here.
Yeah.
That my anger is not good. Or I'm gonna agree with God here that my purity is not good. Or I'm gonna agree with God here that the way I've handled my finances, I'm in debt, I don't give, I don't save, I'm not generous, whatever. We have to agree with God. Most people aren't willing to do that. They're not willing to go, hey, God is right and I'm wrong. I mean, the Bible says that the Holy Spirit convicts of unrighteousness. And so if I'm not willing for the Spirit of God to convict me and go, Jason, you're not an evangelist. You're not doing a lot of what a disciple does. I told you if you would follow me, I would make you into a fisher of men, and you're not even throwing your hook in the water. And so I had to admit for myself first, I had to agree with God. I'm not right, I'm wrong. And when I did that, I just had to start praying. I mean, I do not have some superpower of evangelism, and I'm not the best at it for sure, but I just know how far I've grown. You know what I'm saying? Right. I know how far I've grown, and I went from nothing and not even wanting to. It started with conviction. And then for me, it's just obedience. So when I read my Bible and the Lord is speaking to me, I got to obey and submit. And so I had to overcome mountains of fear, mountains of needing people's approval, mountains of insecurity, not knowing the right things to say. And so those things have been developed in me over an extended period of time. It's just confession, and it's just a desire to obey. That's what, I mean, really, it's this lordship. Jesus, you're the Lord of my life here. I can't make myself good at this. I can't make myself strong. I can't make myself, but you can, and I'm going to trust that. So I'll agree with you, and I'll submit to you. I mean, right?
I think that's powerful, and it doesn't, maybe it comes natural to some people. It didn't to me either. Like I had to put myself in situations, and sometimes even, you wouldn't even know that I knew Jesus by the way. I would jumble it up or get something mixed up and feel like a fool, but somehow God would use it. And I think you just have to keep.
That's right.
You got to get up there and you got to take one step at a time.
That's right.
Try it, and if you feel ridiculous, then just get used to that feeling. But you can't conquer what you won't confront. I think that's powerful.
That's good.
You have to come under conviction about it.
That's right. I like your phrase. We have to confront it. And, okay, if God, many years ago in my life, anger was not good. I had to agree with God it wasn't good. And then I start obeying him. But if I mess up again, do I quit and just go back to my,
right. And you don't just give up.
If somebody's dealing with, purity or pornography, whatever you're dealing with in your life, or you're not giving, and we just got to go. And then if you pull back, go again. You don't just give up.
Right.
So times I would mess up or not obey. Anyway, but we could be on this forever. So
we could. We're just barely out of verse 1 right now.
I know, that's why, 11, that's why we got to get going. Yeah.
Right. So, I want to talk to you about your definition of discipleship. I thought that was powerful.
Yeah.
And that I think it's simple and it's powerful.
Cool.
And that's my wheelhouse. And, as you know.
Yeah.
And so I think having a vision to call people towards is a powerful thing, because you're really saying that discipleship is not, we're not using it as an adjective, we're using it as a verb. It's something that you do.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's when
and a noun.
Right.
I mean, it is really a noun. I am a disciple. It's a verb. I am actively doing this. It's an adjective. It does describe who I am. I mean, I think if we look at everything that Jesus said about what a disciple is, for me, it's summed up in these three things. And it's good for people to know. And I think finally I had some words that I needed to put together to help me remember really what this is and explain to other people. So a disciple is somebody who loves Jesus first in every area of their life, right? Yeah. Like Jesus said, why would you call me Lord, Lord, and not do it? I say, that's essentially lordship. I'm going to love you first.
So good.
Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey me. So we're going to love you first in every area of my life. I don't have a part of my life that I'm like, Jesus, have my life, except I'm going to keep my money. I'm going to keep my purity. Right. I'm going to keep my,
giving access to all of it.
And then I'm going to live in Jesus' community.
Yeah.
How in the world can you obey all the things Jesus told us to do and not live in Jesus' community? And I actually believe that so many Christians are like the two of the three things that Jesus calls us to be as a disciple, we're not doing. I mean, maybe all of it. I mean, most people who would say I'm a Christian, Jesus isn't leading all their life. He's leading some.
Yeah.
Really, he got me to heaven, and he keeps me from selling crack.
You always say you've got some areas you reserve for yourself.
That's right. So, I mean, and then living in Jesus' community, we cannot obey Jesus without living in Jesus' community.
That's right.
I mean, older, teach the younger, rich, share with the poor, all different colors of skin, different places in spiritual maturity. Paul, to the Ephesians, the community, the Jesus-defined community, living in that is the only way. And I like to say, people's names and their needs. That's one of the ways you know if you're in community. Because I'm like, when people say, I'm in a church, I'm like, tell me the names and their needs.
Right.
'Cause where are people in their life right now who's struggling with what? Everybody is with something. And so, and they're, there's strengths. I need to alliterate that too. But if you can know people's gifts and strengths and needs and names and all these things, then you may really be in community.
Yeah.
And how far they've come and grown. Most people aren't in community. And then you love Jesus first in every area of your life. You live in Jesus' community, and you lead other people to find and follow Jesus. Most people as a Christian have not led somebody else to find Jesus or led somebody to follow Jesus more. I mean, the great commandment that Jesus said, go into the world, preach the gospel, baptize them, which is introducing them to the faith, and teach them to obey everything I've commanded you. And we have Christians who are not teaching other Christians. Maybe they've been a Sunday school teacher, or maybe they've been a small group leader, but likely they haven't been. And they haven't ever one-on-one sat down with somebody and said, let me teach you how to follow Jesus in every area of your life. So I don't really know how many people are actually disciples.
Right. And you can't really, like I love Sunday because you connected gospel and disciple. Like you can't not live out the gospel and be a disciple. You can't be a disciple at a distance.
Believing the gospel makes us a disciple.
Right.
Yeah.
And to connect the two of having good gospel conversations as being a disciple.
That's right.
Where for most people, it's in two different categories.
That's exactly.
Evangelism, discipleship.
Totally.
And you're saying, no. Right? And you can't be a disciple at a distance.
A disciple is engaged in evangelism to some degree.
I think it's good for people to hear these things
I do too.
Over and over again. I think it's a powerful thing.
It's good.
I loved also, we'll get it down into verse
we have to, Dave,
13,
because this 13, can't last
15.
an hour. So
no, but you shouldn't have so much content in one verse, bro.
I know, my bad.
Right?
My bad.
But it's all rich.
Thank you.
It is, man.
It was a powerful. It was hard to know when to stop and when to not stop.
I mean, that's probably another podcast of how you figure out what to leave in, what to leave out. But
right.
One of the other quotes that I think we're going to use somewhere this week is, "When was your when that you were born again?"
Yeah.
And I think some people may not have really thought about that. Like, even if you don't know a date, like, when was it? Like, were you 12? Were you,
Yeah.
Like, I'm not sure. I think I could probably get to the date because I know how old I was and where I was.
Yeah.
I remember it. And salvation should have some sort of, it should be anchored in your memory in some way.
Yeah. I mean, even if you were young when you came to Christ, I think something so cosmic happened. You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
Like the Spirit of God invaded the spirit of a human being.
Right.
And that for me doesn't mean, I think some people get so far into charismatica that means you had to have, fallen out of
right. You had some sort of signs.
And the bright light, that was for Paul, that wasn't for everybody. The dove, that was for Jesus, that wasn't for everybody. I mean, I don't think these magnanimous moments that happened to some people in Scripture were meant for all, but still, this moment was cosmic. It was eternal. It was cataclysmic. And I think we should remember, not necessarily, I flew around a room, but something happened inside of me. Something led me to a moment. This awareness of it gets back to like everything really, this awareness of my own sin, and then this acute awareness that I had a Savior and I believed the gospel. Mm-hmm. So I think we would remember a moment like that. I mean, if somebody forgot their wedding date and they've even been married 6 times, they're probably like the woman that Jesus saw at the well. You've been married 5 times.
Right.
Like,
sure.
I think you're going to remember all those moments.
Yeah. Even
if you forget dates and you've had a lot of other things happen in your life. And so I do think we should be able to go, this was when I was born again.
Right. And Paul never got over it. I mean, he never got over that moment.
Don't you think, though, some people use that as an excuse or a reason or whatever to go, yeah, but heard a voice from heaven, blinded light. I mean, that's hard to use as the standard experience.
Right. But I just think it was never lost on him. Like, he never, it wasn't just like, oh, that was an emotion or that was my camp moment. But you see it in all of his writing.
That's right.
You see it, when we talk about, the powerful moment of salvation, like Paul says in verse 12, that this wasn't revealed to me. I didn't learn this from somebody else.
Beg the table or podcast.
I didn't learn this from somebody else.
Yeah.
Right. And so I want you to say something to the people who may be overthinking all this stuff, because, this idea that Paul said, I received this through revelation. I didn't try to just figure this out. He didn't just go away and go, I'm going to figure this out on my own. Instead, there was something that God revealed to him.
Yeah.
In everyone's study, I think some people disengage the supernatural from their study.
That's right.
And I wonder if you could say something about maybe people that tend to make this more complicated than it really is because they're overthinking all of this.
Well, there's a real humility in accepting. I didn't know God well enough to know God, right? Like, I wasn't smart enough or good enough. I mean, that, like, God, there was such a overwhelming element of grace here. I really think a lot of people think, I knew God because I went to church long enough to know my Bible well enough to then I got saved. I'm like, no, you were saved by grace. It was God's grace that let you know the Bible before you were saved. Mm-hmm. Like Paul told Timothy, he's like, you from infancy you knew the scriptures, which are able to make you wise for salvation. Right. By the way, I think Paul, a lot of that was saying the scriptures, the Old Testament that you knew, are able to make you wise for salvation, meaning you could see the gospel, the coming Messiah, the need for a Savior, Jesus is the way. You could see all of that through all the Old Testament that you studied, Timothy. So the scriptures are able to make you wise for salvation, but they give wisdom for it, but the scriptures don't save you. Your study doesn't save you. Your intelligence doesn't save you. Your own goodness doesn't save you. Paul here is just hammering out grace over and over. And he's proving that by going, I knew more than you did. I was smarter than you were. I was better than you were. And that's not what saved me. And I do think for Christians, we have to remind ourselves, because now God has produced goodness in us and he has taught us a lot. But that's not what keeps us saved. That's why Paul later is going to tell them, do you think that you're still saved by not by grace? You think by your works? Right. And so now we're like, oh, now I am obeying the Lord. That's not why I'm still saved. I start 100% in grace.
This is so powerful.
I'm suspended by grace, right? And all that comes how? By revelation.
Yeah.
God is the author of my salvation, not me.
And before Jesus, Paul didn't see it. He knew the Old Testament.
Totally.
And then he goes back to Damascus and rereads it for 3.5 years. And all of a sudden, he could not see Jesus.
That's right.
So it's not in your intellectual ability. And I think a lot of times we've asked theology to do something that only the Spirit of God can do in our life.
Yeah, that's right.
And I like this. One of the other points that goes with this is when you talked about this. When did salvation begin? Like, once again, a lot of people go down the rabbit hole and say, did it begin here? Did it begin here? Did it begin here when I thought about it? Did it begin when Jesus thought about it? And you said, no. You have to, let's think about the uniqueness and the supernatural and the specialness of it.
Yeah.
I think that's where we have to remind people that it didn't begin because we thought I believed. It doesn't really matter where it began. I think that's the point. The point is that it's a unique moment in someone's life when they experience the saving life of Christ. I think,
I'm thinking about how to answer what you're saying. I mean, there's so much I agree with it, and then there's things I want to press into on it and trying to figure out what to not talk about.
Right.
But, I think we should pursue all the time understanding this greatest mystery that God's revealed to us, the greatest mystery of all.
Right.
And by the way, the greatest miracle of all is salvation, that God would save a human soul from our eternal separation from him caused by our own sin is wild. It's the greatest miracle, and it's the greatest mystery. And we should spend our time pursuing understanding it more for the joy that it brings us and the worship that it brings us and the gratitude that it brings us, all of his grace. If our understanding, if our study, if our theology, if our doctrine is not just leading us more towards awe of his grace, wonder of his grace. And so my problem is with a lot of my, I've spent more time in seminary than most people ever have, and more than I should have probably, and I love rich doctrine. I love discussions of theology, but I find a lot of people who they get into trying to answer the technicalities of the mystery.
That's what I want to press into.
They get into answering the technicalities of the mystery so much that I'm like, whoa, I haven't heard overwhelming gratitude for God's grace here. I haven't heard humility and joy. I just hear arrogance about my understanding of the mystery that you don't yet understand. And I'm like, I understand more things about the mystery than I feel like I can explain publicly to people, because it overshoots the arrow for most people of going, hey, look, I want you to end up with gratitude for the grace of God, overwhelmed. God revealed this to me. Salvation came from God to me by his grace, not by my goodness. Wow. That for me that's the penultimate that we should always be shooting for and living in.
We've got to move from arrogance to awe. That's what I hear you say. We got to move from being arrogant about all this to recapturing a sense of awe of our salvation.
That's right.
And so we got to get to this. I'm not sure where we are on time.
We're good. If our developed doctrine moves us beyond awe, then our doctrine has gotten it's hurt us more than helped us.
Right. And I think people need to hear that, because people can get too off in the weeds, too often, you know. I know theology is important. I know doctrine is important, but not at the expense of losing your sense of God saved me.
Well, true doctrine, pure doctrine, perfected doctrine, maturing doctrine leads us to more and more awe. I believe in developing our doctrine all the time, because it leads us to awe. But if you're developing your doctrine and you don't have awe and you have arrogance, then you have completely missed the purpose of growing in your doctrine. Doctrine is, I'm understanding the mystery more.
That's right. And it's making me more appreciative, and it's making me a better lover of people.
That's it. I mean, I'm trying to find out where I said this or exactly how I said it, but
let me see here.
Where was it? Help me, Dave.
Yeah, let me look here. It was
oh no.
Jesus for the world. Let me look here.
I'll find it later. Go on to something else. I'm sorry.
Okay. We'll find it. But the thing after, so I just thought that was a powerful thing, that we have to help people not get so off in the weeds that they lose their sense of the wonder of salvation.
That's it.
And then the thing you talked about was this idea of carrying on. And people need to hear this.
Yeah.
Not quit. And I immediately thought of all the little dumb, like when you go to these kitchen places, it says, keep calm and chive on. And
I like the hand towels or whatever.
Yes.
There's a place we go to in Houston, Brick and I will go to, and it has like every F word on it. It's like every bad thing on it. And I'm like, you can do that with a hand towel?
Right.
That's incredible.
I had no idea.
You need to share the gospel on a hand towel, but go ahead. Yeah.
And so that keep calm and carry on. I don't know the origin of that poster, but that's immediately what I thought about. And the message of telling Christians that you got to carry on.
Yeah.
That Paul went through it and he got up and he carried on.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think we could go push it a little further. Maybe someone who has church hurt. Maybe someone who's gotten burnt out. I don't know. But, we've always talked about that you have to be able to play injured sometimes. You have to get up, you got to tape up, and you got to get back in the game and know that God's with you in it and not let it deter you. Like if you were going to kind of push that into a more pastoral comment, what would you say about that?
I remember when I was just starting Church Project, I heard this podcast from this guy who I respected as a church planner at the time and a pastor, and he said, you can't be a pastor if you can't fight. And I agree with that to a degree, but I've taken it a lot further, and now I've said, you can't be a pastor unless you can take a punch. I mean, you got to fight for things and protect the sheep at times and that, but mainly you just got to let's turn the other cheek. I'm like, man, I mean, being a human being, you're going to get punched in the face. I mean, we all have.
That's right.
Pastors just are around more human beings and in a unique way.
Yeah.
And I think for Paul, we could easily hear when I preach, like one of the things I wanted to talk about here was, the story of the prodigal son and then the other son. And the other son's in the field. And the prodigal son comes back and the father's like, goes out to the other son. It's like, why don't you come in? And he said, I've done so much for you. I've been so good.
Yeah.
I've stayed here and I've served you, and you won't do for me what you're doing for other people. I think it's really easy for preachers, pastors, church leaders, any of us who are serving God in any way in ministry to go, God, look at all I've done for you. I've served you. Right. I've stayed here. Like I kept doing what you called me to do, and then you let these people hurt me. Yeah. And Paul is letting us know, people have hurt me. And he talks about it in most of his letters.
He does.
He just
says,
right. One time, everyone in the province of Asia has deserted me. And I'm like, we get upset when somebody leaves the church that we've loved well or we've fed. I told a guy, I'm like, you weren't a believer when you came here. I fed you spiritual food for years, one-on-one, sermons, house church. I helped you develop into becoming a pastor of people. And over something that I'm not sure about, you've discarded us with wanton abandonment.
Right. In an instant.
In an instant. And we'll do a podcast on that too.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
those will be our record Thursday, post on Friday.
Okay. All right.
But it's so hurtful, but Paul continued, like somebody's calling him a liar. And so he's getting down to the details here. He's like, I was with Cephas 15 days. And I didn't see any other apostle except James, Jesus' brother. No, I didn't see any one of the first 12 except for Cephas. And then I saw James. I assure you, I'm not lying. And I'm like, isn't that crazy? I mean, this week as I wrestle with this, I'm like, the fact that Paul had to say, I'm not lying.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so hard. I mean, for me to have to go, I'm not a liar. To go to tell people, I'm not a liar here. And I think, people assume that people are lying because people do lie. But that doesn't mean that everybody lies.
Right.
Or all of us at some point in our life have lied. But I mean, Paul, it could have crushed him. I mean, I think, people doubting your motives and accusing you of things in ministry, anybody leading, I'm talking volunteer, people who lead volunteer ministry.
Speak it out.
A house church, you lead a ministry, or you're on staff somewhere, or you're a pastor, whatever it is, whatever you're doing, you've been hurt by people, and it's easy to stop. And there are reasons to stop, to protect ourselves from getting wounded too much. Right. And there are other ways to protect yourself, I think, but never completely, because you're going to get hurt. And Paul, thank God he carried on.
That's right. And it's a battle. I mean, Paul said it was a battle. It's a race that we run. There's injury in all of those things, Right. But I thought that was there's people right now watching this podcast that I'm sure are tempted to quit because of someone else someone else, but you can't let the choices of other people make you quit on the will of God.
Yeah.
And I wish, we need that little phrase, carry on somewhere to remind us just to keep doing it.
Yeah, I mean, that's an old British thing, right? But I mean, we've taken some good stuff from the Brits and brought it over here. We can do that with that phrase too.
So verse 15 was where the salvation began, just so you know. I went back and found it.
Well, I knew what the verse was. There was a saying I had. I can't remember, but thank you for that.
That's all right. And then Paul picks it up and he says, 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem, and he starts to lay out the timeline of how he really was discipled in all this. And I think it's a powerful thing to see that, Paul didn't just snap into this. He didn't just pop off the road to Damascus and go, I'm going to write Romans.
Right.
There's something that came before that, right? I mean, there's something in this journey that God takes us through. I mean, how would you encourage someone to just stay in the journey, just keep doing this, where you talked about, Paul had lost it all, and what he might have become had it not been for Jesus, if he had stayed on that trajectory.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, let's look at anybody in the Bible who God didn't sequester for a while and submit to other leaders for a while.
That's right.
And put them out to pasture somewhere for a while.
Yeah.
Look at all the guys from Abraham to David to Moses to Joseph. I mean, look at all these people in the Bible. And
Jesus himself.
30 out of his 33 and a half years. And here's the problem today, that most people want to just immediately pop up, and they take their gifts, really gifted people, but they haven't been crushed. They haven't waited. They haven't submitted.
That's right.
They haven't sought the Lord. I mean, for somebody with his passion now for the gospel and his awareness that the Jews don't know, nor do, my 247 alarm's going off now.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
No, but we won't do it now, but that's
all right.
Just to, I go, every day at 247, I'll do that in a little bit. But I mean, this guy, all of his passion, all of his vision, all of his heart, and he's having to wait for years. And I just think this: most people aren't willing to wait in the name of ministry, in the name of the gospel. They're not willing to submit. They're not willing to grow. They're not willing to learn. And you and I both have plenty of stories. I got stories of waiting for years and years, and frustrated and angry and wanting to give up because I can't wait any longer, And so, and even here in our church, this waiting on a lot of things for you. I'm still waiting on some things that I feel like we should do, or God's called me to do, or I want to do that. We're just not nearly there yet. Right. So waiting is so hard, and Paul just had to go wait.
And he had to submit to it. And I think now, someone goes, I know 3 chords, I'm ready to go be a worship leader, or I got a story, I'm going to go preach.
Yeah.
And God will put someone in the shadows. And it's interesting that from the time Paul goes to Damascus to the time that his second missionary journey, when he shows up to Jerusalem the second time, was 14 years.
Crazy.
14 years before he ever is appointed as an apostle.
Yeah.
To go after the Gentiles.
Right.
So this is real deconstruction. This is not modern day. This is like God dismantles this murderous, bigoted guy and rebuilds him into an apostle. But it took 14 years to do it. And I think we need to say to people, how long are you willing to endure this?
That's right.
How long are you willing to invest in this?
Well, and I think it gets to the end of the passage, which getting close to the end of the time for the podcast is I was unknown.
I was unknown. That's right.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah, so, this kind of goes to what you're saying. Like, people want to get a brand and they get a website and they're going to go out and hit the circuit. I've heard this a lot, especially in music world. People are like, God, make me famous so I can humbly serve you, And yet Paul says, nobody knew me.
Yeah. I mean, like we talked about yesterday, where John the Baptist said, he must become greater, I must become less. And we're all about making Jesus greater, but the idea today is, Jesus, you make me greater, I'll make you greater.
That's right. That's right.
And so really it's
not that way.
It's not the way of Jesus. And that doesn't mean that at some point Jesus won't let some people know our names. I've had a saying in my life, it's been my mantra for a long time, which has been one of the reasons why I've been very reluctant to do some other things. But my saying for me has been maximum impact, minimum exposure. Maximum impact, minimum exposure. Like, I want you, Jesus, to use me as much as you want to. And I need to, and it comes from that verse, and it comes from wrestling with my own flesh, and it comes from seeing other people abuse it all. And it comes from all of that. But I think to know the platform for God using you isn't your fame. It's
That's
your
a good word.
Faithfulness.
That's right.
And so Paul was just faithful to the Lord when he was unknown. And for 3.5 years and then 14 years, the dude is unknown. So rather than pursuing fame, we need to pursue faithfulness.
Such a good word, man. And you didn't start here. Like, you started in Timberlock. How many people did you have on the first Sunday at Church Project?
Well, and by the way, that was after I was thinking, I'm 51. I started working in church the day after high school. Never thought I'd do what I'm doing now. Never wanted to. Still sometimes don't. So that's, 33 years. Church Project's 15. So I was doing stuff 18 years before I started Church Project, where there were 40 people in a warehouse, and I knew like 34 of them or something.
Right.
So it was brutal for years. And I think we have to be faithful, not famous. If God chooses, and I am glad that there are some famous believers. I really am.
Sure.
I mean, there are some people who I'm like, I need to learn from you. We need some people out there. I'm glad you're famous. But if all of us are pursuing fame,
right,
and we think that we can't impact the kingdom unless we're famous, we've totally missed a boat. That's why I think Paul said, I was unknown. I was being faithful to the Lord while I was unknown. I was serving the Lord, growing while I was unknown.
That's right.
So as we wrap this up, I'll just say, our job is to be faithful to the gospel, faithful to our calling, not pursuing fame. He may let you be known to some degree to help people, but that's different. I mean, our job is faithfulness. That's all. And Dave, I love talking through passages.
I love it, man. It's so good. It's so good to hear you amplify these.
Well, you too.
And I think people, there's one last thing on this, is that when people walk in here on a Sunday, they think this is where you started. You know what I mean? Like, oh, you thought of this idea, and thousands of people showed up, and you're like, I was serving the Lord 18 years before this, out in the middle of God-forsaken places that we won't mention on the podcast, but God-forsaken states and other hillbilly places, and you know. And I think to everyone listening, you just got to be willing to do this in obscurity, and God will elevate you
if He wants.
If He wants.
If He wants for a purpose, but that can't be our goal.
That's right.
Hey, thanks for listening to this podcast. That means you love Jesus, you love His Word, you want to know it more. And a lot of people from our local church listen, but a lot beyond too. And that's cool. Share it with your friends. Let other people know about it. Like it, share it. That's all we ask. And see you soon. Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.
Thanks for spending time with us today on the Rethink and Return podcast. Here's all we ask from you. Will you subscribe to this, share this, let other people know about it? That'll help us get the message out. Share this content with other people if it's helpful to you. We're grateful for you. See you soon.